When do y'all get the back doors? Well, good morning. I was going to say, let's try that again. Good morning. Good morning. That's better. Much better. Hopefully, we got a little more sleep last night. At least that was the intent, right? Should have. I want to welcome you all here this morning. Is that too loud? No? Good to go? Okay. I want to welcome you all here this morning. So I'm glad to be back with you. I was out last weekend, had a work event that was scheduled several months ago. A group of us, most of us older than 30, only 2 of us older than 40, decided it would be a good idea to get together and run 200 miles. And at 200 miles between everybody. It's combined effort, not 200 miles individually. That was collectively. But it's a fun time. You get an opportunity to spend time with coworkers outside of the work environment. And when the race starts, it runs until you're finished, about 36 hours. So in between, I had a total of 14 miles to run, and that in between those 14 miles, I had a total of about an hour and a half worth of sleep over a 36-hour period. So you're constantly moving. So anyway, that's where I was last week, and thank God for giving me the opportunity to be there. And it actually was really good. Had some good conversation with some of the coworkers too. Wanted to start this morning, so didn't plan it this way. Never do, right? When I started building this outline probably 6 months ago, want to start this morning. I want to look at, just briefly kind of talk about the statistics of daylight savings. So I know that daylight savings ended yesterday, so now we're back into standard time. And just thought it was really fascinating the way all this kind of worked out. So typically your daylight savings runs from, the dates on the calendar are March 14th through November the 7th. Now that fluctuates a little bit based on when the weekend falls. Only 40% of the countries have adopted daylight savings. So it means 60% of them still run on standard time. There's also some interesting facts related to daylight savings. It has been linked to depression after daylight savings started. Slowed metabolism, weight gain, headaches. These are physical things that we encounter when we go from standard time to daylight savings, which typically happens in March. 24% higher risk of heart attack after daylight savings. The Monday after daylight savings, I think more people die of cardiac arrest or heart attack that day statistically than any other day of the year. 6% increase in car accidents. 8% more likely to experience a stroke. There's an 11% spike in cognitive issues or cognitive decline, and a jump in mental health disorders. And it's also been linked to digestive issues, immune-related diseases, and a whole slew of different things that the CDC tracks and says that there's a correlation between daylight savings and things that we see within our culture. And that started in, I think, 1966. I didn't write that down. Actually, yes, I did. 1966 is when that actually became law. So we've been doing that since 1966, and we have all this data that says that change is probably not beneficial. And so I thought it would be a good opportunity to lead this morning and talk about that change and really discuss, let me go back. I jumped the gun. So lesson 3 review. One thing that Josh mentioned a couple weeks ago was If you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally. We talked about the Spirit. That was something that was very difficult for me to get in front of all you and discuss. It's just such a vast topic to discuss the Spirit. The conversations that followed the class seem to track that most of you feel the same way about the Spirit. There's a lot of unknown there, some things that we think, some things that we're not sure of. But wanted to point that out. That was something that Josh mentioned during the lesson a couple weeks ago. So when we're in need of wisdom, remember we always have the avenue of prayer. We can ask God for that. So jumping back this morning, in the midst of everything and a culture that changes, I want to talk to you just briefly about the unchanging God. And I want to start, and I want to read a few things to you before we get going. Psalms 93:2 says, "Your throne is established from of old. You are from everlasting." Jeremiah 10:10, "But the Lord is the true God. He is the living God and the everlasting King. At his wrath the earth quakes, and the nations cannot endure his indignation." Psalms 92, "Before the mountains were born, or you gave birth to the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God." Psalms 102, 25 through 27, "Of old you have founded the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. Even if they will perish, but you endure, and all of them will wear out like a garment. Like clothing, you will change them, and they will be changed. But you are the same, and your years will not come to an end." Isaiah 48:12, "Listen to me, O Jacob, even Israel, whom I called. I am he, I am the first, I am also the last." So in a world, in a culture that everything's changing, our times change, our seasons change, we all change, everything changes, we have this idea of an unchanging God. That is a very foreign idea to me personally. Just because everything that we see, everything that we're aware of, our knowledge changes, everything changes, except the idea of God. So God never changes. So a lot of times I think when we read the Bible, we have this tendency to look back, and again, y'all, when I say this, I speak from myself personally. I don't want to impose or impart in any words in your mouth, but there's a tendency to look back and say, well, that was thousands of years ago, and you kind of differentiate a little bit between then and now. And so for some reason we do that. Josh, did you have your hand up? Well, we're going to get into that. It's a good question. It's a good question. What's that? His truth never changes. That's absolutely right. And he's perfect. What's that? Perfection. Yep. Man, you guys are. All right, class is adjourned. Yep, 100%, 100%. So this idea of where we stand here in 2022, coming to the end of it, that we look back at the Bible and there's thousands of years between us and them, mostly an agricultural lifestyle, which I'd say most of us don't live that today, although we may farm a little bit at home or whatever that tends to be. So we read about the prophets and we read about Jesus, and we have these different letters to different congregations, and there's a tendency to say, well, that was a long time ago, and it was. But how is that relevant today? How is that relevant today? And one of the things in preparation for this that I read, And the guy kind of drew it out a little bit, and talks about it. You know, if you put everything on a timeline, linear, and you have all these events that are starting from the beginning of history and going to where we are now, and who is above all those? It's God. And so you can draw a line from God to each one of those. So all those events historically, just looking at it from a historical perspective, we're all connected to those events historically through God. So God never changes. So some things that we could say, and you mentioned it about His truth. His truth never changes. His Son never changes. His life never changes. So none of those things ever change. But this morning I want us to look at really three things and kind of jump into this in terms of some things that don't change about God. And we could say a lot, and there's a whole lot that we could say. But I want to talk about sin, His response to it, character, and purpose, and then kind of how that impacts us. So jumping into His position on sin, if I could have someone to read Genesis 3:11 through 19. Okay. So what happened here? First recording that we have that I'm aware of someone going against God's will. It's Adam and Eve. And what is his response immediately? So he had told them not to do what? What's that? To not eat of the tree of knowledge. And what did they do? They did it. And then all of a sudden it starts this, what I continue to see, and at least within my profession today, this finger pointing game, right? Well, it was the snake, and well, it was the woman, and it was on down the line, right? And so then God issues some things. The snake will crawl. The female, her pain will be multiplied in childbirth, and then for the man, the labor. So immediately you see this response to sin. So God responds to it immediately. So we're starting to draw some things out of kind of who He is, right, and what He thinks and how He feels. And so it's interesting, and it wasn't part of the group of Scripture, but does anybody recall what He does immediately after this in terms of with Adam and Eve? What does He do? He kicks them out of the garden, and then what does He do? What's that? Yes, flaming sword, right? So think about that for a moment. Think about that in terms of God's response to sin. So if somebody could read New Testament, Matthew 5:27 through 30, please.
You have heard that it was said to those of old, you should not commit adultery. But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her, has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you, for it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell.
So obviously Jesus is discussing about the adultery component here, and he says, hey, if your eye causes you to sin, what does he say? He says, pluck it out and cast it from you. Think about that process. Jesus is not condoning dismemberment. It's not the intent here. But think about that. Think about that. How would that feel? It's talking about sin, right? It's talking about the avenue in which sin comes through, right? How does that feel? If you're kicked out of your home, right? If somebody walks into your home and kind of drags you out and puts you in the street and they put a guard around your house, what are you thinking in that moment? What's that?
I really messed up.
Yeah, I really made a mistake. I really made a mistake. So in terms of God's response to the sin, when we come in contact with sin and we're trying to separate ourselves from it, a lot of times, how may that feel? It may not be a pleasant process. It may not be something that feels good, right? To go through that, to separate ourselves from whatever that thing is, to remove ourselves. So just very quickly, the way God responds to sin in terms of the Old Testament, in terms of the way we see it now, his position on sin is the same. Yes, sir?
I mean, he's basically telling you to remove the root cause of it when you look at it. Had an internship, basically like a probation officer. When you would get the kids in, you get them separated from their home environment, from the friends who had that bad influence. You get them in a shelter program. They become like model kids, like the kids you want living in your neighborhood. And then you're like, all right, they're great, they're better. What happens? They go back home and they get around the same people, the same influences that led them to do that same thing. And that's why in this situation like we're talking about, God is trying to separate you from what causes, the sin. Remove whatever it is that's tempting you to do what you know you're not supposed to do. It's not your eye that causes you to lust, it's something else.
That's right.
Find another means of taking care of it. Separate yourself from the things that are leading you away from what you're called to be.
Absolutely. Thought I saw another hand, no? So, God's character. So, one thing that I wanted before we jump into these verses, and if I could, if someone could go ahead and turn to Exodus 34, 5 through 7, and then James 1 through 7. I have it on the screen, but if I could have someone to read that, I'm always interested in seeing what different versions we're using. So Exodus 34, 5 through 7, and James 1 through 7. So in terms of God's character, it's not just his name, but it's also who he is. And it's his position in terms of everything, right? Eternity. It's not just a name, it's also a description. So Exodus 34, someone have that?
The Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name of the Lord. And the Lord passed before him and proclaimed the Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering, abounding in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children and the children's children to the third and the fourth generation.
James 1, 7.
But let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord.
Oh, 17. I'm sorry, I have the wrong verse there. Sorry.
Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning.
Okay, so all the way back in Exodus, we see this idea of God being what? He's compassionate, he's gracious. We've already looked at how he responds to sin. Now we're looking at his kind of his character. He wants to be a compassionate, gracious God, and he is those things. Now, sometimes it may come across in a different way because he's trying to remove sin. That seems harsh. It's not. But in terms of God's character, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger. And then I wanted to look at James 1, verse 17. And it talks about every perfect gift. And then it talks about from the Father of lights. What does that mean? What do you think about that? I read some interesting things on the Father of lights. What's that? He is the lights. He is the light. So if you're the Father of all things good, right? You're the center of that. So what happens to that? It radiates, kind of radiates out from who he is. So all of that starts from him. It radiates out beyond where he is. So these are some things about God's character. Will not change. But how does our character change? Have any character changes yesterday? What's that? Looking forward to the extra hour of sleep. Maybe that improves our character a little bit, right? It's one of the things I got up there, sleep deprived or exhaustion.
Sometimes it depends on our circumstances. We change.
Yeah, circumstances can impact.
We allow ourselves to.
Right. You're right. We allow it to. We allow it to. How about if somebody cuts you off going down the road? Does that change your character? I'm getting too close to the fire now, aren't I? Yes, sir.
Oh, in a way, though, your character would drive how you react.
I'm sorry, say that again.
In a way, your character will drive how you react. So if you react to someone cutting you off driving down the road, then that speaks to your character more than your character.
That's right. It's interesting. It's a result of your character, right? So you already have the character there. It took the event to kind of draw it out. Absolutely. Yes, sir.
Thinking along that line, what changes first? Do we work on changing our character or work on changing our reactions?
Thoughts. Change our thoughts, but change your actions.
I have my own ideas on that. Any thoughts on that?
Our actions come from our character. We need to work on our character.
Yes, sir.
A lot of it comes from what we focus on, what we're thinking about as we go throughout the day. So if we are focused upon God, we're focused on the good things of God, good things are going to come out. If we are not, if our focus is elsewhere, that would be when perhaps some unchristian things might come out. I give this example a lot, but I mean, when I was a teen, and not a Christian at that point, I had the mouth to say it. And if anyone cut me off in traffic, there was no way I was driving more than 5 miles without something bad coming out of my mouth back then. One day I was with my sister in the vehicle. Somebody about ran us off the road and into a ditch. And she said something and I didn't. And she looked at me and said, "How did that happen?" I said, "I don't know. I had to stop and think about it." And I realized the only thing that had changed was, it was back in the day of cassettes. I had a gospel cassette and a cassette deck, and it just flipped automatically. So what was in my head, the lyrics to those hymns were going over and over in my head, and my focus was there. If I'd had something different in there, typically did, I had different reactions.
So it sounds like for us, our character is somewhat of a result of a few things that precede that, right? Which I don't think that's the case for God. And so I'll tell you personally my thought and what we talk about within the realm of our company is that the way I describe it to our folks is that your thoughts and your habits develop behaviors, and your behaviors lead to your character. That's kind of the way I describe it to our people. I don't think that's the case with God. God is who He is. There's nothing that needs to happen for God's character to be developed. It's something that we're constantly working on, right? So you are trying to develop thoughts and behaviors, and then ultimately, once we've crossed that bridge in our mind, you're right, when then someone cuts us off, then we've kind of already been there, and we're like, yeah, okay, don't need to respond that way. Maybe we're listening to something, some positive reinforcement, scripture, whatever, but we're trying to reinforce those characters a little bit. So those things can absolutely impact us, but those things do not impact God, because whatever happens, God is God. He is who He is. Yes, sir, and then you.
Years ago, I had to start changing the way I thought about me. And through all that, it changed my character. Now, after I met Sybil, it really started taking big steps in changing who I was. At one point, I had got online and I had found a website that had connected me with one of the ships I was on when I was in the Navy. So I started talking to them, and they were having a big reunion. So I was able to track down a couple of my buddies that was in the same division as I was in. And when I called one of them, his first response was, when I identified myself, he said, "You mean you're still alive?" So my character has changed from that person I was when I was a young guy, which was completely off the chain. And now, maybe after I met you, I got on the chain. But it changed my character. And it changed my actions, and all that changed my direction. That's what I think.
No, I think you're right. But back to what you said earlier, Josh, right, in terms of God being God, he cannot change for the better because He's already perfect, and being perfect, He cannot change for the worse. He is who He is. So His character is the benchmark. Obviously, we'll never attain that, but for us, it's something that we're constantly working towards. And His purpose, trying to move along a little bit. So in terms of His purpose, can I get someone to read Job 23, if I can have 4 people? Job 23:13, Psalms 33:11, Hebrews 6:13 through 17, and then Ephesians 1:4.
First one, but He is unique, and who can make Him change?
He is unique, and who can make Him change? Yes, sir. Job 23:13.
And whatever His soul desires, that He does.
Yes. Psalms 33:11.
The counsel of the Lord stands forever, the plans of His heart to all generations.
Plans of His heart for all generations. Hebrews 6:13 through 17.
For whom God made a promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself, saying, "Surely blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply you." And so, after he had patiently endured, he obtained the promise. For men indeed swear by the greater, and an oath for confirmations for them an end of all dispute. Thus God, determining to show more abundantly to the heirs of promise the immutability of His counsel, confirmed it by an oath.
So in that passage, 2 things. Who does God swear by? Himself. And then there's a word that describes, it says His immutability. unchanging, right? It's his unchanging character. It says he's absolutely unchanging. So we have a tendency, or at least in that passage, again, now I'm paraphrasing, sometimes we swear by things that are greater than us to kind of end the dispute. But God being all, he swore by himself. Yes, sir?
The note in my Bible beside the word immutability says unchangeableness of his purpose.
Unchangeableness of his purpose. And then last one, Ephesians 1:4.
Just as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and without blame before him in love.
Just as he chose us before the foundation of the world. So, what are some things that might cause us to change? I mean, we've talked about some of these things kind of organically a little bit, but stress. What's that? What would cause us, or what could cause us to change? Change careers. Doesn't always have to be a bad change. Maybe it's just a change.
Realizing that bad actions have led to a bad life, and good actions lead to a good life.
So realizing that bad actions have led to a bad life, okay? So maybe if we rewind that, then we go, maybe I didn't have the foresight that I thought I had. What else? Should. I agree. It should. I always tell everybody, and I'm not saying this obviously because my dad's in the room, but the moment that I looked at Caleb, everything that he had told me for 25 years prior to that made sense. It didn't make sense prior to that moment. But when all of a sudden I have my own, it's like, oh, well, that's why. It's amazing how that works, right? Absolutely amazing. So what else might cause us to change? That's right. So what did Job 23:13 said? He is unique, and who can make him change? So he controls all that. That's him. There are things that can make us change. Now we can choose that, right? But sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. But the point is that there is change, good and bad. I changed careers about 10 years ago. It's not good or bad. I just made a change. Now, the reason I made that change is because I realized, hey, this is not really going where I want it to go. I need to think about something differently. I need to take it in a different direction. Does God ever have that thought? Does God ever say, this is not really going the way I wanted it to go? Or this is not going the way I thought it would go?
It's possible because he flooded the world.
I don't think it ever goes the way God. I don't think God's not surprised.
I'm not saying you're not surprised. How about God sets forth to use somebody, and they choose not to follow him, and then God says, "Okay, I'll use this person." But he knew that ahead.
Yeah. So let's break down Ephesians 1-4, or 1:4. So a couple things I wanted to pull out that verse. Number one, chose. Choose. The ability, he chose, the ability to choose. So I have some things highlighted there. It says, speaking to a conclusion. This is right straight out of the Greek. This is the definition, right? Speaking to a conclusion. So before I go any further, somebody read that verse again, please. Ephesians 1, whoever had that, can you read that one more time? Ephesians 1, verse 4.
Just as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and without blame before him in love.
He chose us in him before the foundation of the world. So let's break that down. Chose. Speaking to a conclusion. Foundation. I thought it was interesting that it talks about the idea of a blueprint, of a kind of a substructure that really resonated with me. So I work for a general contractor construction company, and for example, we built a mid-rise 15-story tower downtown a couple years ago, 15 floors up. I think we spent 4 months in the ground before we ever started going vertical. And so when you start talking about the substructure, the foundation, before the foundation, said he chose us. The foundation of what? And world. And that word is cosmos, actually talks about an ordered system. So if I'm just kind of, if I'm looking at this a little bit differently, he made a choice for us before the blueprint or the substructure of an ordered system. It was an intentional decision. So I don't know that anything, but based on what I'm seeing, I can't find where God is surprised or caught off guard or didn't foresee something. I don't see any of that in the scripture. I mean, you could disagree with me, and you just have to admit that I'm right and you're wrong, but I'm kidding, brother. Any questions on that? I'm running out of time, and I even shortened all this to try to get through it all. But I love the dialogue. That's the best part about this. So really quickly, just kind of look at some ways that we could imitate God, right? Because that's really what this is about. This whole lesson is about knowing God, how that applies to us. So if I could get someone Colossians 3:5, someone Galatians 5:22 through 33, Isaiah 43:21, 1 Peter 2:9, Ecclesiastes 12:13. And we're just about to wrap it up. I see little eyes looking in the windows. Whoever has Colossians 3, go ahead.
Therefore put to death your members which are not on the earth, fornication, uncleanness, passions, evil desires, covetousness, which is idolatry.
Okay, put to death. Again, we see that, what's echoed in Matthew 5, right? It talks about, when you read the definitions, it's literally killing that member. Now, this is kind of talking about a component of a personality. Again, God's not saying dismemberment. That's not really the intent here. But it's to completely separate from whatever that thing is. We talked about that character. You said, you're going to start a different habit to kind of get rid. You're going to put that thing to death and get rid of it. That's the idea. Galatians 5.
But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law.
Yeah, and so again, this is something that we looked at a few weeks ago too, Galatians 5, in terms of what is the result. As we put these things into practice, it's the love, it's patience, it's long-suffering, it's kindness, gentleness, all those things that we should emulate the character of God when we look back at was it Genesis 34 earlier? So many scriptures written down here and there, I'm starting to sidetrack. And then our purpose. Isaiah 43.
This people I have informed for myself, they shall declare my praise.
Say that again a little louder, please.
The whole thing?
Yep.
This people I have informed for myself.
They shall declare my praise.
This people I have formed, but for myself they shall declare my praise.
I have formed myself. They shall do what? Declare my praise. Okay. All right. 1 Peter 2:9.
But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim his praise of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light.
Chosen. That idea that we read about in Ephesians 1:4, right? The selecting by it's a definitive decision. God made a decision. We were chosen to proclaim His praise. And this is one of my favorite. I love this one. Ecclesiastes. Absolutely love this one. When you read the book of Ecclesiastes and then you get to the end, Ecclesiastes 12:13.
Hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God
So have you ever read the book of Ecclesiastes and then you get to that and that's what Solomon says and you're like, why couldn't you just led with that? Why couldn't you just started there, man? So in terms of God's unchanging, that is who he is the benchmark. He does not change thousands of years ago to today, doesn't change. That is what we're trying to imitate, right? Our character, our position, the way that we interface with the world. How do we praise him? Are we constantly in a state of praise to him when we're sprinkled out amongst the rest of the world? So, any questions or comments? Anything in review for next week? I thank you all for your time and your patience.